Well, the Greeks held that the visual arts were the imitation of life, but the computer arts are the imitation of creation itself. Thank you very much.
My name is John Schock. I have both the great privilege and the challenge of introducing Alan Kay, our banquet speaker. Why do I say that it's both a privilege and a challenge? Well, my first reaction when I was called up and invited to come make some brief remarks and introduce Alan was that I was very flattered, and I really appreciated the invitation. That although I'm in the venture capital business these days here in Palo Alto, I spent 14 years at Xerox. And I was, in fact, hired into the Palo Alto Research Center shortly after it was formed by Alan Kay. And one of the many anecdotes I've chosen not to tell tonight is about exactly the manner in which Alan hired me, which is a great story that I'll save for later when Alan and I decide to embarrass both of us, or at least when he will tell his version and I'll tell mine. But it was a wonderful time working for Alan, and many of you, of course, know him. And it was a period where I got to participate in some tremendously challenging and wonderful research, and we have lots of wonderful stories. So I instantly accepted, foolishly, and as soon as I hung up, and I thought about it for another 30 milliseconds, the trepidation set in. Because how do you go about introducing someone who needs no introduction, to use a trite phrase? And as I said, I considered lots of stories and anecdotes, and I concluded that I would just stick to a few of the formalities and then just a brief observation. As I said, many of you know Alan, of course, and I'd like to think he needs no introduction, yet conversely, I'd like to think that there are at least some people here who were not only the participants back in those times, and that we're not just talking to ourselves, but there might be a few people who don't know that Alan, of course, has a PhD from Utah. He taught at Stanford, joined Xerox PARC, went on a sabbatical to USC ISI, went from there to Atari, and is now at Apple as an Apple Fellow. I think that's about right, and that's all I'm going to do on that, Alan. Those credentials are not the reasons, of course, why Alan has been invited to come here tonight. Rather, it is what I would characterize as almost 2 decades of a commitment to an idea that spans more than the individual contributions. And that is the idea of powerful personal tools, including but not limited to computers, for children of all ages. Thomas Kuhn, in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, talks about shifts in paradigm and that those are the important inflection points in the evolution of science. And I believe that's what we've seen with personal workstations, that they represented a different kind of paradigm for computing. And when you step back and try to integrate over all the individual contributions in many of the speeches we've seen here, the work that I and others were involved in, I really think it is that shift in paradigm. Now having that idea of that alternate paradigm of personal workstations and powerful tools is necessary, but it's not sufficient. Because in order to succeed, you have to be able to lead others, to exhort them to accomplish more than they thought possible, than they thought that they were able to accomplish. So you have to be able to establish a vision and then describe that vision. And Alan has been able to do that, to create those targets, those images, in both words and pictures. Many of you are familiar with some of his expressions: the pursuit of the Holy Grail, the establishment of a target that we can then try to reach, even if it appears to be well beyond our reach. The Dynabook, of course, is the most well-known of those, although that's only one of many. And those of you who have had a chance to dig through some of the papers will recognize other visions and symbols that were used, including the reading machine, the Kitty Comp, the Minicom, the Flex machine, also known as the reactive engine, and probably many more that I don't know about Alan. In addition, he combined that vision with the ability to express it in ideas and in expressions that we will probably not likely forget. Many of us have heard the exhortation that software is, of course, just like a waffle. You have to be prepared to throw out the first one. We all took part in a meeting in an off-site session at Pajaro Dunes, which many of us would have thought was a retreat to go talk about strategy, which Alan rechristened as a strategy advance. And at that meeting, he exhorted all of us to break out of what we had done and to go back and burn the disk packs. On the other hand, not all of those expressions were associated with the computer business, and one of the fondest memories I have, which I thought of as I drove down here today, was one year, many years ago, Alan, I think we went out for a drink with Bob Barton, who had come to visit, and we went to a local watering hole in Palo Alto, which is now closed and turned into a Mexican restaurant. And as we walked in, and we were going to just stop and chat a little bit, and we walked in, and Alan sort of looked around, and in his inimitable style looked around and said, yeah, it's a nice place, sort of a plush sewer. And he's had a tremendous ability at creating images that can motivate us, establishing targets. And without further ado and without further comment, let me invite Alan Kay up to come and talk about his vision of personal workstations. Thank you all very much. Go get it.
Now, I was reading Toynbee the other day, and I know he's out of fashion, but there was a section that was particularly interesting, which is how do you judge a civilization? Do you judge it on its art, its music, its social functions, its government? Well, I think 100 years from today, our civilization will be judged by the complexity of audiovisual equipment necessary to put on a presentation like this. And I think we should all look at one gloomy note before I start, and that is to realize that there's not a single computer involved up here helping us show anything here. And I'd also, at this point, like to ask everybody to raise their personal computer in the air. Can I see it? I rest my case. Okay, can I start off with the first slide, please? Now, I have to warn you that to me, the coupling of work and station is the ultimate oxymoron. Because I titled my paper, yet to be finished, Playstations, because most of the stuff that I was interested in had to do with advancing forms of play. And when I was a kid, I got very involved with Walt Disney's Fantasia, and it was images like these that entranced me. Now, my background is my father was a physiologist and my mother was an artist and a musician, and I grew up working both sides of the street going along, and Fantasia completely blew me away as a sort of a way of combining many of the senses together. And I thought, gee, it would be really neat to be able to do your own Fantasia. And I thought nothing more of it, for puberty had happened. And one does not think of thoughts like that at age 14. And of course, that one is the kind of thing you think of at age 14. But you know, we have to admit there's a little power urge in all of us, and that image particularly struck me. Now, also, when I was a teenager, I started reading science fiction, and I discovered that Robert Heinlein would occasionally mention things in his science fiction books that actually had existed, and he used them as context. And one of the things he mentioned was the tachistoscope, which I discovered actually had been invented and was used for measuring reaction times and ability of people to see whether they could read a word in a 500th of a second. The other thing that Heinlein mentioned was memex, which he used as a generic term. And I had learned that if I went to the library and poked around long enough, I could find almost any of Heinlein's references. And sure enough, I found As We May Think, written in July 1945 by Vannevar Bush. And I read it with great interest. And I think that I would like to sort of revolve my talk around Bush in a couple of ways, because I think the power of Bush's vision was not that he tried to extrapolate from technology, but rather he took what should happen and then tried to justify it by looking at technology that could happen. In other words, he took a proactive view rather than a reactive one. And my belief is that, in fact, Bush would have thought up the Dynabook if he had his work habits involved going to all-night restaurants. but in fact he was a creature of his times and liked to work at a desk. And so his envision of what a personal workstation should be was a desk. And when I started thinking similar thoughts, I had found long before that I could never work at a desk, and in order to get anything done I had to go to an all-night restaurant and take showers. So some of the early ideas for the Dynabook was that it be very, very portable and waterproof. Now, I guess the other thing I should say before I launch into this thing is that all the stories that we've heard at this conference are success stories except mine. And I consider it my job, my duty, to fail as strongly as I possibly can in a direction. Because I think that one of the differences between practical research and sort of far-out research is the difference between goals and directions. In other words, we're taught that it's a very good idea to make up goals. And in fact, it is, compared to just probing around randomly. But I think that one of the lessons of Park that turned out to be very powerful was that the most powerful thing you can do is set up a set of directions. And I think of those directions as being like a magnetic field. I thought of us all as being iron filings trying to line up in a magnetic field that we're almost also simultaneously trying to create, or salmon swimming upstream. In other words, far-out research is, when you don't know what it is that you're trying to get, is done by smelling your way along. You're looking for gradients and so forth, and you have directions. And that's good, because the goals are the things that drop off first. The goals are the things you succeed at. They're the things you pat yourself on the back. But in fact, the goals, all the goals that we did at Park, I think we realize are obsolete. And yet the directions we had there are still as valid as they ever were. Now, this is a Gazork. And if you don't know what a Gazork is, this is the console of a 6600. And this is the kind of machine I used to program in the early 60s. And in fact, this machine was a wonderful machine. It had about 3 things that would drive you absolutely crazy about it. But aside from that, it was incredibly simple and incredibly fast. And sitting down at the console of one of these babies was just about the right one. I was thinking of Gordon Bell today saying you buy computers by the pound. And I think one of the ways of summing up what I wanted was about 14 ounces of one of those. Sliced to order. Now, in this first 5 years of programming around, I saw a couple of great ideas quite a number of times before I started understanding them at all. And when I was trying to write the paper, I was thinking, boy, it is really amazing to me how many times, for instance, I saw object-oriented programming invented by somebody else and liked it, and yet it never hit me for those first 5 years. Let me give you an example here. See if that goes off. Good. Well, let me just show you something that I ran into when I started programming in the Air Force in 1961. Back then, at least in spite of Doug Ross's early operating systems, the Air Force hadn't learned about them. And Air Training Command had a bunch of Burroughs 220s, which were modest-sized machines by today's standards, but in fact they were rather large physically. And one of the problems Air Training Command had was passing tapes around because the operating system wasn't guaranteed to run, and they had different formats and stuff. And by the time I got there as a fledgling programmer, somebody had thought of this idea, and this is the way they did it. Here's what a file looked like on the Burroughs 220 in Air Training Command. 3 sections to it. First section were a bunch of relative pointers. Second section were a bunch of Burroughs 220 machine code. And the third section were a bunch of records. And the way you used this was you read these guys into core and jumped relative through these guys, which you knew what they meant, and that caused execution of these guys, which you didn't have to know what they were, and those guys could get into this stuff, which you didn't know at all. In fact, didn't want to. If that isn't object-oriented programming, I don't know what it is.
You're here.
So some nameless person used this technique very, very early, and the macro assemblers of the day back then were set up to use it. And I used it too. And yet it didn't hit me how powerful it really was. Here's another one I learned real early and liked, but still didn't realize. The Burroughs B5000. That happened to be the replacement computer for the Burroughs 220, but of course Burroughs never had a difficult time building this machine. But in fact, Burroughs B5000 had many, many innovations, and one of the chief ones was this notion of trying to build an environment for a higher level language. But the thing that was hard for me to understand and hard to explain to other people is that the Burroughs B5000 was certainly the first piece of hardware, I think, that ever tried to make store into a procedure. And it did it the wrong way, but in fact, it was something that was hardly being thought about back then, except by a couple of people like Doug Ross. Now, when as a programmer back then, I had no knowledge of what was going on in ARPA or anything else. We didn't, we enlisted men weren't expected to read. In fact, we didn't, just like the students of today. So in fact, that was another time of seeing a tremendous idea. Then, through a series of misadventures, I wound up at the University of Utah, and I discovered a number of interesting things. One was that Dave Evans was much younger than he looked, and much older than he appeared. But in fact, he's one of these guys who, at age 30, just put his appearance on hold, and he's still out there running marathons. One of the things that Dave liked was Ivan Sutherland's Sketchpad. He had a big pile of these brown Lincoln Labs documents on his desk, and before you found your desk, he would give you one of these, and you had to read it and understand it. And I'd like to show you the first sequence from videotape. This is the earliest known movie of Sketchpad. This was done in the summer of '62. I show this a lot today. So here's Ivan with the blood starting to run out of his hand, but that's okay. Now notice he did something that we all are familiar with, but now he's pointing to all these edges and he's telling Sketchpad to make them all mutually perpendicular, and Sketchpad figures out how to do it. And the reason is that Sketchpad is not just one of the first graphics systems, but it was the first non-procedural programming system. That might be disputed, but let me go on with it. Here again, he's making a couple of lines. He's saying, make them parallel and perpendicular, and Sketchpad straightens them up. Now he's using a constraint called collinearity, and the little dashes are aligning themselves right over the guidelines there. Okay, and now he's telling the guidelines to be invisible, and he's made his hole through the flange. You notice that Sketchpad is the first system to have a window, as far as I know. In fact, it drew on a very large virtual canvas. Now he wants to make a rivet, and once again, he only has to indicate the general topology and the rules that will constrain the topology into being what he wants. That's going to be the center of an arc. And now notice this clever thing, that if he makes these mutually perpendicular, that will force the, well, you see what I mean. There it is. And now if he distorts it, it will still obey that general geometry. Now, he could have constrained the ratios of the sides just as well and kept the rivet a specific shape. In this case, what he's done is constrained the angle relationships and center relationships, so we always get a symmetric rivet. Now, Sketchpad is also, I believe, the first true object-oriented programming system, because what we see here is actually a dynamic instance of that master drawing that was just done. He called them masters. Nowadays we call them classes because of Simula. So you notice he can take that instance and twirl it around and make it different sizes. And he's going to stick it into the hole in the flange here. And one of the reasons we can tell how early this is because in this whole film there's no illustration of visible constraints. And that was the second phase of the implementation of Sketchpad. Here's a few more. Now you might ask, why is the screen blinking? Well, the TX2 here is putting up every dot by brute force. So he's gone back to the master and he says, well, I really don't want to see those guidelines. I'll make them invisible. And notice all of the instances feel them dynamically. And anything that you can construct in Sketchpad can itself be a master. So he's taken these two building blocks, the flange and the rivet, made it into a master, and now he can create instances from it. Well, if this isn't home cooking, I don't know what is. This is the kind of thing, if somebody did that today, we would say, my God, that's unbelievable. Okay, stop the tape, please. Because one of a British art historian by the name of Letheby said that a work of art is 1 man wide and many men deep. And something like Sketchpad has the interesting characteristic is that it's not just a work of art, it's a masterpiece. So it is 1 big man wide and 1 big man deep. So most of those ideas were ones that although Ivan sort of gathered them up, the data structures came from Doug Ross's papers, and there were ideas here and there, and he scrounged a matrix multiplication program from Les Ernest and so forth. The vision here was so pure that it stands up today. If somebody were to do a system as good as Sketchpad today, we would like it. It also is the only known computer graphics thesis in which every illustration was done by the thesis program. Think of that. Okay, so that was pretty exciting. And another thing that was exciting at Utah is Doug Engelbart, who in those days used to travel with a special, this is how much he wanted to communicate with people. He used to travel with a special 16mm movie projector that could stop frame. And he would be there with one of these things and his stop frame thing. And the reason is it's very hard to explain a system as good as NLS in a dynamic movie. It's hard to see where the cursor is, and it's hard to see what's going on. And so he had evolved this style of talking about it that was really incredible. And as I recall, the movie he showed then had a green characters on a screen, and I think it was the 3100 implementation of the system. Well, it completely blew our minds at Utah. We just could hardly believe what he was trying to do, and of course it has some roots in Bush's ideas also, but in fact one way of characterizing Bush is that he was trying to find something that was complementary, a complement to human abilities. This is the way he writes in his paper. And Doug was trying to augment human abilities. And if I could characterize what I tried to do after seeing his stuff, it was to try and allow the system itself to be augmented by the human, so that the augmentation would actually be mutual back and forth. And I still believe that is the main problem of personal computing. But anyway, I think all of us who were at the 1968 Fall Joint Computer Conference, and I know Butler mentions it in his paper, this was, I can't take the time to tell you about it, but believe me, it was like magic. ARPA spared no expense, thanks to Bob Taylor. I hesitate even now to mention the figure that they spent to put that on. I'll let Taylor decide to say if he ever wants to, but believe me, the whole objective of this thing was they had to illustrate what the concept was, and they spared nothing to make it work, and it was an unbelievable thing, even for those of us who are fairly familiar with the system. Just never forget it ever.
I've forgotten the number, Alan, but it was worth 10 times the cost.
Yeah, it was. I do remember the number, and yes.
You never knew how much it cost.
Now, there are some other things that aren't easy to talk about, but I just have to say that there have been many people who have had an enormous influence on me in my somewhat strange career. One of the greatest is Butler Lamson. And the SDS 940 was one of the things. That machine was so wonderfully designed, I can't tell you. But that was the machine that Doug Engelbart's stuff was implemented on. It was one of the major machines, thanks to Bob Taylor again, that we used in the ARPA community. And again, it wasn't just the fact that it was rather inexpensive and rather responsive and so forth. There was a whole set of secondary things in that system that were so important. For instance, Butler had this odd notion that machines occasionally crashed. And in fact, the system was designed mainly for crash recovery. And so those of us who used the machine can remember many years in a very flaky era where we'd hardly lose more than a couple of characters a year, if that, through many, many crashes. I can't explain all the details why, but it was beautiful, and it made a tremendous impression. Now, those influences, thanks to Dave Evans, who hooked me up with a crazy Texan by the name of Ed Cheadle, resulted in this design in this machine called the Flex machine. This is sort of in a general period, 1967 to 69. And while I was doing this, I looked at the link of Wes Clark, and liked it very much, but in fact, I didn't understand it. I originally poo-pooed it because it didn't execute a higher level language, and it was small and all of these things. But I'll return to that story in a minute. So here's what the Flex machine looked like, and it's as drawn on its own display. And we liked Doug's idea of tying a brick to a pencil as sort of a de-augmentation concept, but we sort of thought that's what a mouse looked like, too. And thought that tablets might be better, which I still think they are. So we built a tablet. And windowing was in the air then. There was a lot of hookup between Utah and Harvard, where Ivan was at that time, Ivan especially was worrying about 3D clipping and windowing, and Cheadle and I were worrying about 2D clipping and windowing. And the Flex machine had a 2D windows, and in fact multiple windows. But of course in a calligraphic display it is somewhat a low-calorie exercise to overlap windows. It just results in a jumble. What ran on this machine was a simulation language that I had derived from Simula. I essentially had an enormous revelation when I learned Simula the hard way, because I had to, and discovered that Simula was a programming language that created the same objects that Sketchpad did all these wonderful things with. And that was an amazing thing, because it meant that in some sense we didn't have to solve the constraint problem in order to do many of the same kinds of things that Sketchpad was able to do with great difficulty. So here's an example of what the structures in a Flex program of the day. There is a scheduling queue which is very similar to Simula, an instance that had the local variables for a particular patient. The instance pointed to what we now call a class, which contained generic patient behavior, and that was how the Flex machine was organized. This is what the Flex code looked like on the Flex display. This is the Flex machine itself was organized like the B5000. That was one of the worst mistakes I ever made. And not because the B5000 was a good idea, but in those days I didn't understand a very important truth, and that is that good ideas don't often scale. And in fact, we were trying to build a machine that would sit on a desk, And we've spent all of this time worrying about the processor and forgot totally that a computer is mostly memory. So that's too bad. But the machine basically had 3 virtual processors all implemented by one set of microcode. Now, the reason I'm telling this story, of course, is the Flex machine was a complete failure in a variety of ways. Technically, I think it was pretty much of a success. Cheadle was a genius and did a great job. And my problem is when I tried this system out that was designed for lawyers and doctors and so forth, it absolutely appalled them. They shrank away from it like somebody does from the plague, or the way people nowadays do from APL. Had many of the same user-friendly appearances to it. And that was the first time ever in my life I realized that graduate students in the rest of the world were 2 different breeds. We loved it. We thought it was very powerful. And one final thing is the Flex machine, this is not a packet switching network, but it did use coax. This, in fact, was what is called an urgency scheduling coax, in which the transceivers themselves have an urgency and a priority register, and they sort of vote among themselves as to who's going to get the thing. Well, while brooding about all this stuff, I ran across the work of Seymour Papert and had a revelation, and that is, boy, we certainly don't wait until kids are in graduate school to teach them how to read or how to use a pencil. In fact, we like to get them at things as soon as possible. And really, in many ways, the idea that Papert thought it was worthwhile teaching kids to program and important, so forth, changed my whole idea about what a personal computer actually should be. And that is, there should never be a thing called a personal computer that isn't accessible to children. There are very few things. It's not dangerous like a car, guys. There's no reason waiting until they're 18 to give them 6 months of driver's ed, like the Boyer report says. In order for it to really be a full-fledged medium, it has to do 2 things. It has to be accessible to children, and it has to be used for mundane tasks. So one of the things we thought about early when we were thinking about it is it's a personal computer if you are willing to put your grocery list on it, carry it into the grocery store, and out again with 2 bags of groceries. How many people would do that with what they call their personal computer today? So this notion that it somehow should fit humanity and everything, which is a rather novel one to me, was very important. He taught a course called Advanced Systems Design, and the first day he told us, well, there are a few things known about systems design, but most of them are written down, and I want you to read all of them. But my job in this classroom is to firmly disabuse you of any fondly held notions you might have brought here. So in fact, what he did was to garbage collect our confidence. And that was the best thing we ever had. Those of us who lasted out the class and the flying chalk and all that walked out of there feeling that nothing was sacred, including Bob Barton. It's very important. And Bob got me reading McLuhan, and I'm not going to try and explain McLuhan's ideas here, but I think the most important thing that has been said in this century can be said in 2 ways. One is McLuhan said, I don't know who discovered water, but it wasn't a fish. That's the simple way of putting it. And the other way of looking at it is, in order to pick out a message from the noise, you have to know what the carrier of the message is. So you have to know the difference between a fly speck and a period. That means you have to know what unadorned paper looks like. And because you have to learn what unadorned paper or unadorned television or unadorned computers are like in order to pick the messages out of them, you have to absorb what they are. So you become what the medium is, what the material is, in order to use it as a tool. That's pretty heavy-duty stuff. And because we become it, we don't know that we are it. So this idea of actually being able to shape the way people think about things by designing the material carefully was something that became very important. One of the things that, of course, my old mentor, Dave Evans, has been around a little bit. He was Butler's thesis advisor, my thesis advisor, and was on the Algol committee and a few other things. And one of the things that Dave liked to do with his graduate students is to invite them into high-level negotiation meetings, because he figured that graduate school should be a transient place. He hated the idea of it, and he wanted us to learn how to negotiate. So one of the things he did is he invited all of us graduate students into one of the ARPA contractors meetings that was held at Utah. And we were there to watch the big boys deal it out. And it was most interesting, I can tell you. And at the end of the thing, Taylor asked all of us whether we had any suggestions. And of course, there were several. And Warnock piped up saying, you know, if you guys are really, well, he said it a little more subtly this, and he said, if you guys are really thinking about it, you know, we are going to have our PhDs pretty soon. All the graduate students should be meeting together right now. And Taylor thought that was a great idea, so they set up a similar graduate student contractors meeting every summer. And Warnock and I were the first two to go from Utah. And I talked about the flex machine there, and Warnock showed his great algorithm. But the great thing we saw was at the University of Illinois, which is the very first plasma panel, the first flat screen display. Now, it wasn't this large. This display screen violates Kay's law, which is that all 1-inch flat screen displays work and no 5-inch flat screen displays work. Now, that law is still true. But in fact, they did have a 1-inch flat screen display there, and a lot of us graduate students who were there spent the rest of the time thinking about what it would be like to put a flex machine on the back of that display. Because if you're doing input and output with a display, then all that cubic volume there is absolutely irrelevant. And my new version of Engelbart's brick on the pencil was, imagine dragging around a digital watch with a CRT on it. Wouldn't that be ridiculous? So this idea wasn't called the Dynabook then, but this idea that this is one of the destinies for the computer that goes with you started around the summer of '68. And of course, the idea was it should be down at the lowest level so that kids this age could use it. And this quaint idea of portability. Now, 0.5 herniations per block is not portability. So there's this notion that you should be able to carry something else too. And now the link came forward really strongly, because everything I started thinking about then reminded me of the link, because one of the things, as you'll learn tomorrow, is the link was designed as cleanly as anything has ever been designed. It was beautiful. It's just I'm salivating right now thinking of it. And that was the first time I had learned about it, because I really needed to learn about it as to what they were actually able to do with almost nothing. It was fabulous, and it's worthwhile studying today. Let's show the second segment. Now, what this system is a system called Grail, done at Rand Corporation. Here's an early menu. And this is the system. This has sound on it.
Erase a flow arrow, then move the connector out of the way so that we may draw a box in its place.
So it recognizes the box and makes one. Now it's recognizing as printing here.
The printing in the box is being used as commentary only in this case. The box is slightly too large, so we may change its size.
That's where Mac window control came from.
Then draw a flow from the connector to the box. Attach a decision element to the box and draw a flow from it to scan. We then erase the flow arrows attached to the process post new area and move the box to a new position. This allows us to draw a new box. Then chop off its corner and label it subscan with a residual error.
Now notice it misses the N here, and he sees it, but
Draw a flow.
He can keep on going. Now he goes, changes it.
Correct the label. Add a decision on subscan so that control may flow to the connector A0. Then complete the diagram from scan to post.
Okay, stop the tape. Okay, now that system blew my mind. It came along just at the right time, because this system was tactile. It was like sinking your arms right through the glass of the display and touching what you wanted to do. And it didn't matter whether they implemented flowcharts or not. But in fact, I read Lick's 1960 paper just recently and discovered there was a section in describing a system just like that. And I think the RAND people had obviously read it also. But this system removed the barriers. You were right there. And mention a couple of other things about it. You could dive through any of those flowchart symbols. It was really a hypertext kind of thing, a multi-dimensional thing. You could simulate the diagrams. It would flash the diagrams. There's a speed control up there. It was modeless. And modeless doesn't just mean generic. Modeless means that you never have to terminate what you're doing in order to do something else, and you just saw it there. It's one of the most important ideas in user interaction. And this is the first system to really have it in spades. There have been other ideas before. This is great. This system barely worked. It was on such an incredible kludge of hardware and software that it eventually collapsed under its own weight. I used to show this movie about every 3 months at Park. We used to show it, you know, because we wanted it, we didn't want a system that had flowcharts, but we wanted it to be like that. We wanted to have that level of, we wanted it to be not even visual, we wanted it to be tactile. Just had to be organic, you know, it had to be messy and stuff. Okay, let's look at the next slide. And now I'm going to go quickly because my goal is actually to get to the Park movie in 1 minute, which I'm not going to be able to do. So here's just some, now of course I knew we couldn't do a Dynabook right then, but this is 1970, and I'd started consulting for Taylor at Park and thought, boy, we should be able to take some television sets, and this is the old Flex rubber bedsheet tablet. If you want to make one for about 25 cents, this is how to do it. And using Lisp techniques now for a simulation, to implement the kernel of a simulation language, look like a really great idea because you get an incredibly small kernel and the rest of the system is self-describing. Okay, now, what I want to do is digress for just a couple of minutes if I can. This talk is really in 3 parts. I'm right at the end of the first part. Middle part is shorter, and what it is it's kind of a lie in that this is not exactly the way I was thinking back then. This is after 15 years of trying to explain these ideas to people. But this is what I'm going to tell you next is what I think really drove what we were trying to do. And it's a much better story than we were able to tell to anybody back then. This is Park. This is the time to give the tribute to Bob Taylor. He actually deserves another one, so I'll say a few more words. Now you notice, let's see if there's one before that. Okay, this is a typical way Park was organized. It was organized this way because Bob, I think, had 2 goals in mind. One is he wanted to be different, he wanted it to be comfortable, and I think he'd also discovered that it was impossible to leap to your feet to denounce anybody when you were sitting in a beanbag chair. There was this curious passivating effect that they had as you slunk in, and I think there are many people in the room that remember what they felt like after trying to sleep on one of these, because your body gradually, as you slept, sank into it and assumed the strangest positions that you woke up. But in fact, this was the way Park was set up. I'm not sure who that person is there, but that youngster I don't recognize either, but he doesn't look very trustworthy to me. And one of the efforts to communicate with Xerox was a set of stuff called the Pendry Papers, and I wrote one called Display Transducers, and this is the drawing that I made for it, showing 2 ways of doing a display transducer right now. And I won't bother going through the features, but you get the idea. Should look something like that. And Xerox had a projection technology, a light valve technology that had some promise back then, so I threw that in also. Now, this is an important point, I think. The most misunderstood thing about the Dynabook is this idea that it's some kind of box. It isn't a box, and it isn't a piece of hardware. What it is a service. And so the idea back then was it's a Dynabook if it gives you your information services wherever you are on Earth. And so there are lots of different ways. We used to say we don't care if there's an atomic-powered computer on the moon beaming down computations as long as you can compute wherever you want. So this is an idea based on Ivan Sutherland's head-mounted display and realizing that that was a pretty good way of doing it. In fact, that's something that should be looked into today. And then the next effort at Park to get something built was this a design idea called Minicom, and this was done in conjunction actually with Gordon Bell and Alan Newell. So they remember very well, we sat on this very strange panel at a fall joint computer conference talking about various machine futures, and I went through this machine showing how you could package a thing like a link but a little bit better into something real small, and it would be really powerful. You could do great stuff with it for kids. And Herb Grosch, who was an old warhorse, got up and denounced this whole idea as being absolutely ridiculous. And Fred Brooks, who was the fourth person on the panel, said to Herb, Herb said, "I've been in this business for 20 years, blah, 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 blah." And Fred Brooks said, "Herb, I'd like to make an ad hominem remark." And he said, "Most of us don't take nearly that long to make up our minds." Now, of course, I knew that this meant that my ideas were good, because being denounced by Herb Grosch has been a sign that your ideas are good. At the same time that that was going on, a group led by Bill English, who had been the main technical guy for Doug Engelbart, was building a system called Polos. And this was the original design of the Polos terminal. And that will fit into the story. I think Butler and Chuck will have a good version of it. And here's the Engelbart mouse, which was great because it existed, but it was very hard to draw with. And I think part of the problem with it was that nobody really wanted to draw over there, and it was perfectly fine for everything else. Polo's group wanted a different mouse. This is sort of the chrome and tail fins mouse, but it had the same basic drawback, is that you couldn't draw with it. And finally, we built this. This was an idea of Bill English's and Roger Bates, $200,000 worth of hardware. Let's see, Butler Lamson, Bill English, Roger Bates. Roger built the thing. This is a thing called the old character generator. 40 megahertz of video back in 1972, and you could do almost anything that a television screen could do. Driven by a Nova, and you could capture images by this television camera. Here's what that thing looked like back then. And here's an experiment to compare drawing something in a notebook. It's a design of an autogyro that I did, and comparing it to the best we could do in painting on the system. This is the first bitmap painting system done by Steve Purcell. Now we get to this middle part, because this is the pivotal point on which I think most of our ideas revolved, and that is that at some point we had to grapple with the idea that there were going to be real people using this stuff. And we had already committed ourselves to children, and when we talked about it among ourselves in the spring of '72, ourselves were just a few of us, Chris Jeffers, myself, John Schock. We had no idea what was going on. And here's an illustration of why this is difficult. Now, if you look at this picture for a while, you'll see something wrong with it. Everybody see it? What's wrong with it? Teeth are upside down. What else? Whole mouth. What else? The eye. Okay, well, let's take a look at it right side up. Now, notice that even after you knew what the trick was, you still had an emotional reaction when I turned it right side up. It's significant. I have to put it back here to talk because people won't listen to me if I... And the unfortunate thing seemed to be that in order to understand what's going on, we have to admit something that none of us want to admit. And it's not that the universe is not in our control. That is awful, but we usually are forced to find that out a lot earlier. But we have to admit something almost as bad, and that is that we don't live in reality, but in a dream of our own fashioning. A good one for people who doubt it. This is something that's good to do every morning, along with your jogging. You take your thumbs or your 2 quarters or an orange. You can do it right now. It's okay. Cameras are on me. And you hold one as far as away from you as you can, and you put the other one about halfway there, and compare the 2 sizes of them. Don't squint, just look at one and then the other. And most of you will see that the one that's further away is about 80% the size of your thumb. If you do it with quarters, the quarter will be even closer in size. And if you think about that, that can't be, because that image of the smaller one on your retina is exactly 1/2 the size. So what's actually going on is you're not seeing what your eyes are seeing, but you're seeing a reconstruction based on your beliefs of the world. And it's that reconstruction that allows theatrical performances to work. And it was understanding that user interface is basically theater that advanced us quite a bit of the way. Now, oh, I should tell you let me tell you the final part of this story is this illusion is actually known about physiologically. On the under right-hand side of your brain, where you worry about faces, there are 2 completely distinct little modules. One module worries about face-like things. That's the thing that allows you to see faces in clouds and scares children in twilight and so forth when shadows look like a face and they think it's a monster. And that's reporting an upside-down face-like thing. And about 1 inch away, a separate piece of brain tissue is only worried about eyes and mouth. And it's saying, well, that's an okay mouth and those are okay eyes. So there's very little dissonance here. When we go to this guy, the face recognition guy is saying that's a right side up face-like thing, and the eyes and mouth guy is saying something is very wrong here. Now you can imagine why evolution might have arranged for you to worry about this, because it might mean you're going to die in the next 10 seconds. Sorry. Now I can tell you it also works on mammals. Also works on all mammals, and if you'd like to try it out on a dog, I suggest you pick a small one. Okay. This is the place that's going to start the 3rd part, because that is the first image ever to go on an alto. And let me now continue with our misunderstanding of how the mind works. What I'm presenting here are not my ideas, but once I got this strange idea that our mentalities might be modular, it reminded me a lot of reading Piaget, which I never really understood very well. That is Piaget's fault, by the way, in case you don't feel bad when you read Piaget and find it fumbling, verbose, and obscure, because, in fact, that's the way he writes. Read somebody else's summary of the stuff. The ideas are kind of good. So Piaget had this idea that there are 3 main stages of development in children, a sort of a doing stage, which he had a long, complicated word for, an image stage, and a symbol stage. The doing stage is where an object is to grasp it and a hole is to dig it. The image stage is where the kid gets the water pouring wrong. You know, you pour from the squat glass into the tall, thin one, and the kid says there's more water. Then Piaget says around 11 or 12, the child starts dealing with facts and logic, which I think is a special property of Swiss-French children. I've always felt it's around that age that logic fast disappears. Now, Jerome Brunner was the person, I think, of all of the people that I read that influenced me the most. He wrote a number of books that are classics. Unlike Piaget, Brunner is one of the classic writers of prose in the English language. And around the early 60s, he was pushing the following idea, that instead of being stages of development, what we've got going in children are actually separate mentalities and a change of dominance. So one of the experiments that Brunner did is to take a kid who would do the water pouring thing wrong. He would say there's more water in the tall, thin glass, and then Brunner would immediately cover up that tall, thin glass with a cardboard, and the kid would say, oh, wait a minute, there must be the same amount of water because where could it go? And Brunner would take it away, and the kid would look at the glass, and he said, oh, but there's more, look at it. And Brunner would cover it up again, and the kids would say, oh, there must be the same because where could it go? So if you have any 10-year-olds you'd like to torment, bouncing them back and forth here, and you do it partially by blocking the visual field. And so Brunner had convinced himself that there were actually separate mentalities with separate rules, and of course there are people like Gombrich and Arnheim who thought the same thing about the way we look at images and do visual thinking, that Brunner built a curriculum around it. And the curriculum had several interesting ideas. One was, it's really great to learn things in this order, because even though the symbolic one is the most powerful, it's only powerful when it's in the right context. In other words, what Brunner said is that logic is a weak method. It's really great when you're in the right territory, but it stinks when you aren't, because it forces you to build up chains of things that don't lead you anywhere. Well, in other words, if you want to multiply two numbers in 60 AD, you're in trouble. If you want to find out where Mars is going to go in 1325, you're in trouble. You have to be an incredible genius and work with your Roman numerals or epicycles in order to get something, simply because the context is very poor. We call those ideas choosing the right representation in computer science. I'd also read a book by Hadamard, who did a survey of the top 100 mathematicians in the world, and being French, he included himself in that top 100. But in fact, he was. I always thought he did this in order to atone for having invented the Hadamard transform and force us all to learn it. But his survey indicated that of these top 100, only a few claimed to use symbolization at all. They all claimed to use visualizations of some kind. An amazing 30%, including Einstein, were operated down here. Einstein's quote was, I have sensations of a kinesthetic or muscular type. So Einstein actually could feel in his arms, in particular, the spaces that he was dealing with. So this Hadamard's book is the cliche, genius is the ability to recapture childhood at will. Or you can look at it from Brunner's point of view and say that people we think are creative are able to think in more than one scheme. And the most creative people are the people who can move from one scheme to the other. This also reminded me of a lot of musicians that I'd read about that, like great artists, conceive their works down here where the blood and guts flows. And then in our civilization, they bring it over here where you can apply 6 centuries of technique to make it the most beautiful thing that can be imagined. So this notion of being able to move from one to another was very powerful. And also this idea that when you try and explain things to people, the weakest way is to tell it. Better to show them. That's why we started giving demos right away. But much better to get them to do it. And that was something that we didn't do so well at. We didn't sit them down often enough in front of the terminals themselves so they could get this visceral feel until many years too late. So this idea that there are different ways in leads to this little experiment you can try. This is inspired by Seymour Papert, and that is to take a child in each of these 3 stages or mentalities and get them to try and draw a circle and logo. And Papert had done it with very young children by just getting them to close their eyes and say, make a circle with your body. So the kid would start going like this, and if he didn't fall off the stage, you could ask the child, what are you doing, Johnny? And the child would say, well, I'm going a little and turning a little over and over. And if you type that into logo, you get a perfect circle. That's because the 5-year-old knows differential equations. Right? The circle has constant curvature, and so the change in curvature is 0. And Papert explicitly made logo egocentric, inertial coordinate systems, in order so that the kid could play the turtle, be the turtle, and use what his body knew what his mind did not, if you will. If you do it with a 10-year-old, you get a much different set of results. The 10-year-old really doesn't want to do that. 10-year-old tends to be very visual, and so a way to get them to do is you give them a compass and let them draw lots of circles. After a while, they decide, gee, the compass is a constant distance y, so the points are the same distance apart. This ought to work. And so you pick the pen up, go out to the rim, make a dot, you come back, turn 1 degree, round you go, and you get a perfect circle. Locus of points equidistant from a given point. Now, of course, I wouldn't be telling this story if the 15-year-old succeeded. 15-year-old is in the symbolic fact logic stage and knows the most horrible fact ever discovered by man. Okay. Wrong coordinate system, and even if it were a good coordinate system, it has very little operational significance. So this led to a slogan. I like to do things by slogans. I later discovered people used to complain to me that it wasn't being professional. I finally found that Francis Bacon, in the New Organum, which has to be a classical enough text to inspire anybody, 1535 or something, Francis Bacon pointed out there are two ways you can explain things. One is in prose, in which you essentially defeat involvement by explaining everything. The other is by form of an aphorism, which draws people in and tries to get them to complete it themselves. And so my characterization of this is that point of view is worth 80 IQ points. All right? In other words, if you're in the right context, you act as though you're incredibly smart and able. And if you're in the wrong context, you don't. De Bono has an image of if you're digging for gold and you've dug down 5 feet and you haven't found it, one of the things you can do is dig twice as fast. That's American business. When in trouble, redouble your efforts. But in fact, you might be in trouble because you're digging in the wrong place. You might be doing the wrong kinds of things. You might be having the wrong kinds of thoughts. So maybe you should shift your context. So anyway, this set of ideas. Now again, I want to say that we didn't talk about things exactly this way. We read Brunner a lot. And in fact, it was Adele who solved how to use Brunner with the children, as you'll see in a minute. That led to a slogan, which is, boy, wouldn't it be great if we could tie these 3 things together? But in fact, you might be in trouble because you're digging in the wrong place. You might be doing the wrong kinds of things. You might be having the wrong kinds of thoughts. So maybe you should shift your context. So anyway, this set of ideas. Now again, I want to say that we didn't talk about things exactly this way. We read Brunner a lot. And in fact, it was Adele who solved how to use Brunner with the children, as you'll see in a minute. That led to a slogan, which is, boy, wouldn't it be great if we could tie these 3 things together? Doing with images generates symbols. This is the Brunner direction. You should do concrete things concretely. So we used to say simple things should be simple, and complex things should be possible. So Perlis had this great line once, a programming language that does nothing simply is not worthwhile learning in order for doing something complicated. So there should be some commitment to some point of view that gives you leverage. My final example is something that came about a few years later, but still in the scope of this, and that is the following, that a guy in Malibu, California, wrote a book called The Inner Game of Tennis. And in it, he purported that tennis was actually rather easy to learn, and in fact, what you should do is not think so hard about it, not worry, and so forth. Just go out and do a few things. You should be able to learn how to play tennis in just a couple of hours. And that enraged Harry Reasoner, who was at ABC in those days. And I think Harry Reasoner is from someplace in the Midwest and knew goddamn well that tennis was not easy. He'd been trying to play it for 25 years. And so he sent an ABC News team out to do Tim Galway in. They picked out 35 people and got them to sign legal affidavits saying they'd never played tennis before. And they picked the worst one of these, who was a 55-year-old lady, 40 pounds overweight, 5'2", and a muumuu. And in front of all of these people on live television, they put a clock at the side of the court and said to Tim Galway, you have 20 minutes to teach her how to play tennis. And the next video selection will show you what I mean. Now, if you're interested in user interface and teaching and stuff like that, as I think you must be if you're here, take a look at this user interface.
me.
We're
And
in
as the
good shape
ball
now.
flies through the air, I want you just to watch it. In the very instant the ball hits the court, I want you to say bounce. In the very instant the ball hits the racket, I want you to say hit. So you'll just be saying bounce, hit. All you need to do is watch the ball, okay?
Bounce, hit.
The key of all the exercises in the inner game is to focus the mind's attention somewhere where it will not interfere with the body's ability to hit the ball automatically. You stand here and Tim will throw you a couple, and you just continue doing the same thing.
Should I try to hit it?
Not at first. At first, just say bounce when the ball bounces and hit when you would hit it, but don't hit it. Then after you feel like hitting it, go ahead and hit it.
Okay.
Now watch your right arm here.
Bounce, hit.
Something's trying to hit the ball right now.
Bounce, hit. Bounce, hit. Bounce, hit.
Okay. When a player is first learning the game of tennis, and when he says bounce, he's also out of the corner of his eye watching me hit the ball. So even though he's not trying to see how I hit it, the image of me hitting it is going right into his memory. You enjoying yourself?
Yeah, it's really fun.
You like that? Okay, here we go.
Love it.
The cardinal principle in any book written on tennis, about tennis, is to watch the ball. No tennis player really sees the ball enough. And the reason is they get bored. So I've tried to give them something to see in the ball that's interesting. So we watch the trajectory of the ball, the gracefulness of the line made by the ball as it flies through the air. Always it's the same. Put the mind somewhere where it can stay calm and not get you uptight, but relaxed and interested. Then the body does so beautifully, so beautifully. You might start listening to the ball, Molly. Listen to how it sounds in your racket. Hear that?
Yes.
Hear that one? What does that sound like?
Very dull.
It was like wood. That wood sound. Keep listening and you'll hear the sound that you like pretty soon. Just listen to it. Okay, now listen on this side. How to go. Okay. Now be aware that racket is part of your arm. That's it. Just feel it. Don't try so hard. Let it happen. That's it. Do what's comfortable, Molly.
Every time I did start to think, things went wrong. When you just stop thinking, the body seems to know what to do.
Can you feel with your left hand where it is? There you go. Just in the back there. Feel it. Okay. Now, I'll tell you what, Molly. We're going to do one other stroke now. And this one's called the serve. And the serve is just like a dance. It's just like a dance. We'll come back here and I'll show you how to do a dance called the serve. Okay? And I've done this dance a little bit, so I'll just do it. Okay. Ta-da. Now, in fact, you can start humming if you want. The rhythm like this. Watch this. Da-da-da. Da-da. Out loud. Okay, now, here's what you do. Once you stand there, shut your eyes, and imagine yourself doing that same dance. You might start humming a little bit. Da, da. As you're doing it, yeah. Okay, now what I want you to do is no thinking, just go do it, quick. Just no thinking, just go serve, yeah. Serve. Fine, don't worry about missing. Keep serving, don't think. Go, do, quick. That's it. Down. Fine, again, don't worry about hitting that.
Notice the wrist snap.
Out loud, let's hear it. Out loud, the rhythm. There you go. I get them to hum the rhythm of my serve. So they're not thinking, oh, this is what he's doing with his elbow, this is what he's doing with his hands. They're not trying to remember all that. They start humming. And they see themselves doing very similar things, muscular movements, to what I did. But they're not thinking about it, so it just comes out naturally and fluidly. So that didn't take long. That's called serving.
Out. Out.
She didn't double fault the entire match.
Don't miss it. Sit. Come, 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 come. Okay? Okay, that's your first point in tennis. Score is 15 love.
Fantastic.
Okay, Molly. No need for you to miss.
Okay, this is a 30-ball rally.
Everything became effortless. I was just sort of like floating along, you know, and doing what came naturally, you know. And I said, I'm playing tennis. You know, it's really, really beautiful.
Have a clear idea of what you want. Then let it happen. Don't try too hard.
Now he zings a couple at
I'm
her.
going to try to make you miss, Molly, because it's going on too long. So I'll just get a little bit harder. And you just keep watching the ball. They're rooting for you, Mom. Don't be distracted. Keep on that ball. Oh, that's fine. That's called tennis.
Well, when I saw that, my reaction was, holy shit. But in fact, that's what we were trying to do, because one of the things you see here is that, as Tim Galway liked to say, beginning tennis is called chase the ball. And when you're chasing the ball, you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing when you're playing tennis. So his feeling is you should do anything that you can to catapult a person as quickly as possible into the lower ranks of the intermediate, which is what he did here. So that most of the time what she was doing is doing the kinds of things that real tennis players do. And also to get involved in the actual process of joy, because you don't play tennis if you don't like to hit the ball. You can also try and win, but mainly it's about hitting the ball and moving your body and those kinds of things. And he gets her involved in it right away. The whole idea behind the kinds of user interfaces that were done at Park was to simply trying to get past all that bullshit at the beginning. There's no reason you have to learn MS-DOS to get rid of a file or move things around or find an application or any of those things. Those aren't intrinsically hard. There's no entropic reason why you should spend a long time doing those. Now, what we didn't do so well at Park, either in CSL or SSL, is find that way of getting from the concrete operations to the symbolic. It's one thing to delete 3 files by dumping them into a trash can, but when you have to delete 53 files, things aren't so much fun anymore. And it's that bridge of finding ways to teach the person the symbolic ways of doing things while they're doing the concrete operations that I think is one of the cruxes in user interface design today. Now, here we go into the last part. This is a photograph, I believe, as far as I can tell, it's marked April 73, and that is exactly the right time for it, for this to be the actual photograph of the first Alto screen. I think it was the very day that Steve Purcell got this image up there, not more than a few hours after Chuck and Ed and Larry had finished debugging the thing. So that was the start of an era of the most tremendous fun I've ever had in my life. And I just want to show you a little bit of it. You get an idea of what we're all after. So now let's start on that tape B. And the challenge was, why can't, if Hewlett-Packard can do it, why can't we? Of course, we had a few more functions in mind, but still the HP35 was there to inspire us. I also discovered that one of the things about having an HP35 is that it's very stealable. Now here's, this is the character generator I mentioned, built by Roger Bates and designed by Butler and Bill English. And this is Ben Law's font design program, one of the best ever done, doing an A in Lydian cursive. And I put this up. This is the exact same thing as I showed you on a slide. So I'm trying to invoke your imagination as to how wonderful this really looked in person. Here's an interesting thing. What do you do when you do a rough draft and you're printing it out in Times Roman? And the answer is you use your own handwriting. I never understood why this didn't catch on. I think it's a logical consequence of font mania. So again, the text can be rendered very nicely in handwriting. Here's a phonetic font that we thought teachers might be interested in designing from Pittman Initial Teaching Alphabet. I never thought much of it, but one of the nice things was that we didn't have to tell teachers what to do on this system. Now here's the world's first painting program done by, I designed it in the spring of '72, and Steve Purcell, that most amazing person, did this while he was, I think he was a sophomore at Stanford at this time. And I'm not sure he'd ever written a program before in his life. I never asked anybody that I hired whether they'd programmed or not, so I usually didn't want to know. And the other thing you notice is that the control here is being done by a character recognizer, and that was done by none other than John Schock. That proves that venture capitalists can learn how to program. So most of the things that Mac Paint could do, this system did. So we see the different brushes, and you can make up your custom brush shapes right there. You'll occasionally see the symptoms of an analog mouse here, I believe. Occasionally it will jump a little bit. Make small brushes and so forth. I should mention that in these early things you'll see some flicker because I shot all of this early stuff on a Bolex in 16mm, so we didn't have any video equipment back then. Specular reflections, and let's see, I think we make a brush here and do spray painting. No, I guess not. There we are. So this was well running by the summer of '72. And I should mention that one of the reasons why most of the stuff we did at Park worked out, there's the Cookie Monster that I drew. This is a Xerox executive. Here was our mascot, Winnie the Pooh. Space War practically drove Smalltalk into existence. We wanted Space War to be half a page. And here's some early animation from, I think, around August, done on the old character generator. And from all of this simulation, we got an idea of just how much power the Alto would need to have to do all of this stuff for real. I think the next segment is an example of some music. I did the music programming on the Nova. Nova 800 was a pretty good machine, and it could do the following. This was keyed in by Steve Saunders. Now, of course, what we didn't want was just 4 voices like that Brandenburg. We wanted 12 because 12 are what you need to do things like organs and other keyboard instruments lower in stature than the organ. And so we sort of multiplied what that could do by a factor of 3 or 4 and multiplied the animation by that. And we'd also done some studies on what the dot size of the display should be. We discovered that that there was a completely nonlinear transformation in the eye, that there was a place when you went from 50 dots per inch to 100 dots per inch, which cost you 4 times as many dots, which was pretty expensive, but it was 10 times harder to see that they were dots. If you think of it, the last thing you want to see on a display is a dot. And if you think of that there might be a maximum in that curve, it happened in Cornsweet's book, when you work it out for video displays, that the worst possible display resolution that you can ever choose happens to be 50 dots per inch. Now you might wonder what IBM's resolution is. It happens to be 50 dots per inch. Now let's continue. I want to now mention that there are 2 people who really, this is the last of my stuff here. From now on, the group was run by this wonderful person. Notice the pigtails, folks. This is, and this is the first kind of stuff that kids did in Smalltalk. Smalltalk was done by the second great person, that's Dan Ingalls. Without those two people, nothing would have happened. I did have one little thing to do. Okay, stop it for 1 second, please. I did have one little thing to do with Smalltalk. I wrote the original evaluator, but I neglected to leave out things like the storage allocator and things like that. And it came about as a result of a bet. I said, well, you can do an arbitrarily powerful language in just a half a page of code. And unfortunately, they called my bluff, and I had to figure out how to do it. And I finally wrote that half page of code, and Dan went out and implemented it for real. And it took about 700 lines of BASIC. But I only wrote a half page of code. I want you to know that. And when the Starkweather's laser printer started working, people used to accuse me of writing my page-long programs in pocket Bible fonts. Now, this next sequence is, I don't know why we actually shot this, but this happens to be the first time a window is ever done, an overlapping window is ever done on an Alto. And I wrote my usual 1 page of Smalltalk, and Diana Mary sweated for months doing all the code that I never wanted to see in order to do the following. Okay, let it go. Now, in those days, I felt strongly that windows should be draggable. I still do, damn it. So the idea was if we could ever do animation reasonably, we should be able to do this in real time. So notice that that text is overlapping there. This is practically like the first day it worked. And now we're going to display, you notice the other guy is popping up in front. This is one of those little ideas that people have in the shower. And here's, now we needed some frames, and so this is a little frame program using the Grail ideas of having little moving handles and stretching handles to go around this stuff. I once asked, I always found it strange that Park was willing to put a $20,000 machine in my office but wasn't willing to put a $1,000 shower. I explained to them I got much more done in the shower than any other appliance. Nobody would ever believe me. Showers. Now, here's a great sequence. This is Larry Tesler's Minnie Mouse editor, which he did to convince the Polos people that modeless editing was the way to go. This is written in Smalltalk. And this is an example of very early programming in Smalltalk, and it's to do the list, a cons class. So what you see there is a message called first time, which when it creates the instance is going to look for a head and a tail. That's like cons. Here is, if you see is followed by question mark, then return the answer list. If you see is followed by list, then return the answer true. So what we're typing in here are responses to messages that any member of this cons pair might have. And if you see anything else, return false. And if you see the message head followed by an arrow, then rebind head. So that's the same as replaca. And if you don't see the arrow, then just give back the answer head. So that's the same as car. And here, if you see the message tail followed an arrow, then give back tail. That's replacta. And if you don't see it, then give back tail. That's cooter. And that's all you have to do to create an infinite number of Lisp cons pairs. I think you can barely see some on the side. When they put this thing to tape, they unfortunately cut off some of the stuff. So you notice this editor, you're just moving around. You'll notice him be able to go back to this transcript. So he made himself a list there called X. And now you can't, that's too bad, it's off the screen. have to redo that. But what it's giving back is B, and now he's putting a C in there. And now he decides, well, I'd really like to see that stuff printed. So he goes up here and he says, look at the Smalltalk evaluator. And what gets printed out is this loop. Repeat, read something, give it the message eval, and then give it the message print. And what that means is that for any new class we make, all we have to do is give it the message, a response to the message print, and it will print automatically. So that's pretty neat. Print is thus generic. Print is distributed over all the classes in the system. So here is this guy's local thing. You notice in Larry's editor, you just go up and fix the thing that you're working on, put a few more things in there. And that's not quite right. So you go back and change it. So you want to print a left parentheses. You want to send the message print to whatever's in the head. You want to print a period. You want to send the message print to whatever's in the tail, and then print a right parenthesis. And then if you go back down here in Larry's editor, you see it prints out A.B, which is what it's supposed to do. And he says, oh, well, why not go in here and give it a response to the message length? And that is, if the tail is a list, then we want to, the response is 1 plus whatever the length of the tail is. If the tail isn't a list, then we are the end, so our length is 1. That's all you have to write there. So if you type that in, back comes the answer. And if you go down and make it a little more complex to cons C to the existing thing x, you get C dot A dot B, and you can't see it there, but length is giving back 3. So that's a quick pass at Smalltalk, and that is the language that the children programmed in. Everything was done by writing those class definitions. Now, meanwhile, Purcell was not idle. Now, Chuck and Butler both complain that the alto is slow, and that is the only dispute I have with them. That is absolute bullshit. Look at this. This machine could do 120 square inches of graphics in arbitrary, freeze it for a second, please. 120 square inches of graphics. It was about that much graphics. You can divide it up any way, 80 ping pong balls or n number of Pegasus or something like that, in 2.5D with transparencies at 10 frames a second. That's what the Alto could do, and it took 300 words, 300 instructions of microcode to do that. And I believe that Purcell had to will part of his brain to Faust. But aside from that, really worked well. Okay, so that was an example of the Alto really moving along. And in fact, I think, just as a comment here, I think that if we had only done the following on the Alto, which is to added 1K of microcode RAM a year, we would have been in fantastic shape, because that's what we ran out of. Let's go further. And I think the next sequence shows that music was coming along. Here's a piece written by Chris Jeffers. And around this time, we moved into our playpen downstairs across the street at what used to be the Singer Building. This piece is called The Happy Hacker. There's the organ that's playing the piece. This is great stuff. Now, here comes Adele and Joe. Now, we always believed that Joe was some secret lover that Adele had had, but in fact, we discovered that it was a little box that she would give a name to, and she came up with a way of teaching this very abstract, high-level language that the Japanese are very interested in these days to young children by giving them an already written class called Box, and you could make a box and give it a name and turn it, and here's Jill, and you could turn her, and you could, right? And right from the beginning, the kids would start off doing things that involved more than one thing, more than one instance of a class. So here's one where we turn Joe one direction and we turn Jill in the other. This method of teaching the children was so effective that after the first couple of bunches, Adele was just able to leave her little box book around and the children would pick it up by themselves. Because basically all you have to understand about Smalltalk is that you can make instances, the instances can receive messages, and you can add more messages to the class definitions. So here's a more complicated repeat loop that grows one and shrinks the other while it's rotating them. And this is when things really started cooking, because we were able to, instead of doing turtle graphics, which never leads to a tool, we were able to get to what one of our major aims was to have children be able to do their own applications programs. Adele organized all of this stuff. I was sort of in the background helping a little bit, but she conceived of all of these programs, she wrote the curriculum, she just did everything. Now here, I think, is the first tool ever done by a child. This is Marion Goldine's painting program. She had seen Purcell's painting program, so she decided to write one herself. So there's a menu up there of shapes that you can grab. Those smaller ones are brushes there. So now you can imagine behind this that there's actually a single class called Polygon that every time she points into one of those is making instances that can splat up on the screen. The polygon can be called with 4 to make 4 sides, and it can be called with 6 to make a hexagon, and so forth. So there's very little code here. And in fact, this program is not much larger than it would be in Logo, but no Logo child has ever done that program because it's not at all obvious in Logo. Part of the thing with novice programmers is that they have to use their short-term memories for all kinds of things, and you have to have some way of allowing them to see how structures go together. Here's some very young children that we did in collaboration with Radia Perlman from MIT, and they needed big buttons to push, and they could drive the turtle around. The turtle could remember things, and so even very young children could write procedures, and their big problem was doing planning.
The music editing system is under constant revision in an attempt to find a comfortable user interface for editing notes and timbres. This is an excerpt from a movie we made about computer music. The star, Rachel, has played piano since she was 5 years old.
So it's being captured.
She corrects her mistake with the note.
But it's okay because you can edit that transcript.
At age 6, Rachel began Suzuki method violin lessons.
Notice her keyboard technique
Suzuki
there.
philosophy is to introduce children early to music and art skills, developing the necessary motor skill dexterity and hand-eye coordination, and making the learning of these skills as natural a part of the child's development as our language skills.
So she's
Our
played.
own pedagogical philosophy.
She's
is to
played.
make thinking and design skills.
Shut up,
just as
Diana.
natural a part
She's-
of the child's cognitive
She's
development.
she's played in accompaniment. Now she's going to play along with the accompaniment. Now this is sort of our idea of what a convivial tool really means. Now, of course, Rachel was just
Marion decided to teach her own
an
class
average
of seventh
kid.
graders. Throughout our work, we have encouraged and emphasized the value of peer teaching.
Now here's,
in order to give
this is a
child
nice thing that
experience
Adele
in
organizes.
ideas and problems,
Marion
and
was,
in trying to understand the descriptions of other students.
had an enormous amount of chutzpah, and she decided it would be great to teach a class of students. So We videotaped literally every second of this.
You can write box on the screen too. You can write box, do it, right? You'll just write box.
And we learned a lot from this. Now here is Susan Hammett with her escalation of the painting program. Notice there's a menu down here. Now, and this is sort of her version of what we now think of as Mac Draw. Of course, Mac Draw is 70K of machine code, and you have to buy it. But aside from that, this is very similar. So I noticed there are little birdies that came up there, and she's changing the color. And she's going to change the size of the thing. Now she's going to move it. She's going to make another instance of it. She wants to select one of them, so she puts out the birdies or handles there. Now she's going to make it very small, because if you make it small and make it with a lot of sides, you get a circle. And again, she can make instances of that. Well, she changed the color. Now she's going to make instances of that. And so this is an applications program done by a 12-year-old child, and it is not large. Let me claim the generic one page for it. It must be in some font. But actually, it's quite a small program. So it's really only one class definition and a menu. She did the menu. Menus weren't built in. Now here's Steve Putz, who has unfortunately grown old like the rest of us. He's actually in his 20s now. At age 15, he was interested in ham radio, and he hated to draw a circuit diagram. So he did this system, which is pretty damn sophisticated. It has a menu like there, a pop-up menu for often used things like open and closed dots. And it has so he wants that right where the cursor is, right where he's looking. And down below, he can pick up components and, as you can see, rotate them. This is one of my favorite programs by a child, because less than 10 years before, a PhD was awarded for a system that wasn't as good. So he felt at this point that there was some hope for progress in novice programming. And the final feature he demonstrates here in a second is being able to float text wherever he wants it in the drawing. This is about, all the stuff I'm showing you was done between the summer of 74 and the end of 75. And finally he types in the text. Now, it was just around this point that we started seeing where Smalltalk started running out of steam. And part of it was a design, it was a prop. Oh yeah, here's Bruce Horn. I think this is the first time this is done by anybody in real time.
Quarter note, 8, 16.
He's 15 years old also here.
All notes higher than middle C are displayed on the treble clef. All lower on the bass clef. Now let's see a demonstration of this program in action.
It's too bad it's off the frame there, but you get the idea. It's pretty damn good. Now here's the timbre editor. There were a lot of people involved with music. Chris Jeffers, myself, Ted Kaler, Chuck Thacker helped a lot in the early stages of it, Bob Shure, Steve Saunders, who figured out how to do Chowning's FM without using a multiply, which we didn't have. The alto could do 12 voices in real time of the kind of stuff that the Kurzweil does, but do it better. It could do 8 voices of real-time FM. And it could do it without any hardware except additional hardware except a D to A converter. This is another 300 words of microcode. So if you take 300 words here and 300 words for the animation system and add another 1,000 or two for Smalltalk, you can do pretty unbelievable things on an Alto. I think it's still my favorite machine I've ever used. It was just sort of right. So here he's changing the pitch between those two bars to get a vibrato, and now he's going to a different timbral palettes, if you will. Here's woodwinds. But what he really wants is something like a bowed string, like a cello, which is something that FM can do really well. And then you can play a piece that you've played in or edited in real time. Each voice with a different timbre. This is one of our favorites, is the fugue from the Passacaglia fugue in C minor. So the idea was, on a personal computer, you should be able to get all of this function without there having to be any hardware specially prepared, except things that you always have to have, as Wes Clark points out, like D to A and A to D converters, for God's sakes. But all the rest of this stuff should be done by software. Remember, hardware is just software crystallized early. And what we really want is to crystallize our functions late. Now, here is what was made out of Purcell's animation primitives, a system called Shazam, done by some visitors, Ron Becker and Eric Martin, Tom Horsley, with some assistance from Purcell and some of the gang, doing what every animator always wanted to do, which is to draw in a cell there on the right, and then the left, the movie window, just pick up that thing you've drawn and showed it what to do. This is a wonderful system because with Purcell's microcode primitives, the whole user interface for this was only 5 pages of Smalltalk. And they did 4 different systems that summer of '74, which is when this was done. So notice he's single-stepping it, because what he really wants to do is to get a squash effect down here. So he's going to zap that guy there, and what he's going to do is to tie that space in the frame into another animation cell, which is transparently superimposed over the thing on the right there. So when you see that menu coming up, it's actually for the transparent cell. And what he's going to paint here is not going to disturb what's there. He's just using it as a reference. And notice it's being inserted in real time. In fact, you could do dynamic graphics inserted in real time. What the animator wants to see is how many features of the image does he have to include before you get the illusion of single frame squashing. So as he puts in the specular reflection, you see that does it. Just one frame changed, but it looks like it's squashing. And just to give Steve Purcell a few more plaudits, one of the problems with doing a system like this is that white is ambiguous. It can either mean here in a thing like a window frame here, it can either mean transparent or it can mean opaque. And the default was transparent. So here he's got a blob animating there, and now he's going to bring up this guy and just swing it around. So we can see that the holes in it are actually letting us look through. So now what he's done is this is the painting window, and now he's going to opaque paint, and he's going to paint over those. And notice the painting is being simultaneously looked into the other window there. And so now some of what was white transparent is now white opaque, and now he's going to pick up the thing and moving around. This is all done on the Alto. Amazing. one of the great stories, of course, is the great leaps backward possible in research. In fact, we never did anything like this as good again. Another one of our famous 12-year-old girls who loved horses, as they often do.
Program that has the horse galloping across the screen.
Now, Shazam was bigger than a 12-year-old can handle, but we discovered that kids can read much larger programs written by other people and make modifications. And so she was able to add a feature to this animation system that she wouldn't have been able to program herself.
And now I have a jockey. I can superimpose the jockey.
This is the feature she added, which is to allow images to be combined into single animated images, just like Sketchpad. And now she has a composite.
Now I can have the jockey and the horse run across the screen by making another program.
Okay, I think there's a pause in there. Well, this is the end of my talk, except for one announcement and one more little show, and that is, I didn't know how to talk about all the stuff we did at Park. There are many years of work afterwards. And in fact, I didn't know how to really talk about the Dynabook of the future. I still think that, as with Bush's original vision, if somebody just sat down and implemented what Bush had wanted in 1945 and didn't try and add any extra features, we would like it today. I think the same thing is true about what we wanted for the Dynabook. If we only had what we wanted then in one machine, we would like it today. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that the Dynabook covered everything. One of the things that I didn't anticipate was what networks really do to you. And that is they change the whole environment that you're in. They don't just hook environments together. And I subscribe, like everybody else, because we were all old time-sharing hackers, to the idea that a personal computer is always connected. But in fact, the very connection of it through the Ethernet changed everything. The Ethernet dominated, and the press protocol for printing dominated all the machines that were on it. It was the thing that was eternal, and the services it provided, not the machines that we built. And the kinds of services that you can get through networking are so large and so vast that almost none of the browsing techniques that we originated at Park are going to be of any use in 5 years. So there's much more to come in personal computing than just the Dynabook. But I'm going to stop here with just one look ahead, and it's a look that we didn't do at Park, but one I got from a person who worked at Park, Alvy Ray Smith, wonderful person, and yet another graduate student of Dave Evans, Ed Catmull. And this is a special effects sequence done at Lucasfilm. And it returns to my original theme of Fantasia. And everybody should be able to do their own. And the Fantasia here is that there's a gadget called the Genesis bomb. The Genesis bomb can be exploded on an airless planet, and a fire races across the surface of the planet and converts the planet into life. And of course, the dichotomy of the thing is, of course, if you explode it on a planet that already has life, it converts that into new life too. So it's both the ultimate life giver and the ultimate life destroyer. They wanted to show what this would look like. And they went to Industrial Light and Magic, and they said, oh no, that's too complicated for model building, too much detail. We can't show mountains rising and waters coming up. And they went to the animators, and the animators said, oh no, we can't do that. There's too hard to do. It costs too much. We can't get it done in the Philippines, and so forth. And so the computer science group at Lucasfilm said, well, let us take a whack at it. And here's what they came up with. What I have done is I hated the original music in the film, so I just deep sixed it. I found some much better stuff written by Wagner. And also, I mean, if you're going to steal, you might as well steal from the best. It's like, say, never steal anything small, and make sure the lie is large. The music, though, is also synthesized by computer. So what we have here in 1 minute and 10 seconds is a vision of something that if we were to increase current-day personal computers by about the same ratio that the Alto increased cycles from time sharing, we could do in 5 or 6 years. So this is definitely on the horizon, and this, I claim, is what we all at Park had in mind. And I don't think, you can argue with me, but you can't prove I'm wrong. Remember, the truth is but a lie that hasn't been found out yet. Okay, so let's roll this sequence. Well, the Greeks held that the visual arts were the imitation of life, but the computer arts are the imitation of creation itself. Thank you very much.